Emma Carter sat alone in her small Portland apartment, the soft hum of her laptop and the gentle tap of rain against the window filling the silence, and for the 10th night in a row, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration as she stared at the endless notes and faded images of a man who had lived more than 1,000 years ago, Ivar the Boneless. She didn't know why, but his name had pulled her in like a magnet, stirring a curiosity she had never felt before, a pull that went beyond history and fact, a feeling that touched something deep and fragile inside her. Emma's hands hovered over the keyboard as if the right words would appear if she just let herself think hard enough, but no words came, only the ache in her chest that had started the first night she began her research. She had expected to read about battles, betrayals, and bloodlines, yet what she found instead was a story of a man who had lived with limits no one could understand, whose body had been considered a weakness but whose mind had been sharp, cunning, and unforgettable, and every page she read made her heart beat faster, made her imagine a life shaped not by strength but by intellect and survival, a life that seemed impossible yet breathtakingly real. Outside, the rain painted streaks across the window, and the city lights flickered in the wet streets, mirroring the restless thoughts inside her, thoughts that felt as if they were walking alongside Ivar himself, trying to understand him, to step into the past without leaving the present behind. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes, feeling both tired and alive, and wondered why she was suddenly so drawn not just to the history, but to the human story, the loneliness, the resilience, the longing behind the legend. The apartment felt quiet, almost too quiet, and she realized that in her obsession, she had been talking to herself, whispering questions into the empty room about courage, about fear, about what it meant to be remembered. "How can someone so broken be remembered for so long?" she murmured, her voice soft, almost swallowed by the rain, and the words echoed back at her, filling the space with something she hadn't expected, an unspoken connection, a bridge between her and a man who had never lived in her world, who had no reason to touch her life, and yet did, across the centuries. She thought about the stories she had read, the fragmented scrolls, the chronicles, and the modern historians' theories that tried to reconstruct his life, and every version seemed both real and distant, leaving gaps that her mind could not resist filling, imagining the quiet moments between battles, the silent frustrations, the clever plans whispered in the halls of power, the pain of being underestimated by everyone around him, and in all of it, Emma felt a strange companionship, as if she were seeing herself in him, feeling her own struggles reflected in the shadow of a long-dead man who had survived, thrived, and yet remained misunderstood. Her fingers twitched over the keyboard, wanting to write something that could capture even a fraction of what she felt, but she knew words would never be enough. She closed her eyes, imagining what it would have been like to meet him, to see the intelligence in his eyes, to witness the way he had commanded respect not through force, but through understanding, and the thought made her heart ache, a mix of longing and admiration she hadn't felt for anyone in a long time. Emma's apartment seemed smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the quiet of her thoughts, the rain a soft rhythm that mirrored her pulse, and she realized she had spent days isolating herself, drinking coffee late into the night, scrolling through translations and historical notes, and still she felt incomplete, as if the story was not finished until she found some connection, some way to bring it into her own life. A soft knock on the window startled her, though the apartment was on the 4th floor and no one should have been there, and for a moment, she imagined it was him, Ivar himself, reaching through time to tell her something she could not yet understand. She laughed softly at the thought, a little embarrassed by her own imagination, but the warmth lingered, a tiny spark in the quiet night. Emma's mind raced, jumping from one thought to another. How had he endured? How had he turned weakness into power? How had history remembered him so differently from the reality she was beginning to see? Every answer led to another question, and the questions felt urgent, alive, as if the past and present were folding into each other and she was the only one standing at the intersection. The city below was a blur of lights and reflections, the rain blurring the edges of reality, and she felt like she was in a dream where centuries could collapse into one moment, and in that strange, electric feeling, she realized that she was not just learning about history, she was feeling it, breathing it, letting it seep into her, and it was changing her in ways she couldn't yet name. Her phone buzzed, a message from her friend Daniel in Toronto, asking if she had eaten, if she was sleeping, and Emma stared at the screen, smiling softly, because he never judged her for disappearing into work, for following something she barely understood herself. She typed a quick reply, a little embarrassed to admit the depth of her obsession, and then returned to her notes, scrolling through another ancient manuscript, feeling the pages beneath her fingers as if she could sense the presence of someone long gone. Time passed differently that night, hours folded into minutes, and Emma barely noticed the storm outside or the faint glow of the streetlights. She was completely absorbed, every thought charged with tension, curiosity, and an unexpected tenderness for a man who had lived so long ago. The more she read, the more she felt a strange echo of her own loneliness, her own longing for understanding and connection, and she realized that the story of Ivar the Boneless was not just about history, it was about being human, about facing limitations, and about discovering strength in unexpected places. Emma leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, and whispered once again, almost to herself, almost to the empty room, "How can someone so broken be remembered for so long?" And in that silence, surrounded by rain, laptop glow, and shadows dancing on the walls, she felt the first real tremor of something she couldn't yet name, a spark of emotion, a hint of longing, and the sudden, undeniable sense that her life was about to change, not because of what she had learned from history alone, but because she had finally allowed herself to feel something deeper, something that reached across time, connecting her heart to a story that had waited 1,000 years for someone to notice. Emma Carter's days blurred together as she dove deeper into the life of Ivar the Boneless, her apartment slowly filling with notebooks, highlighted pages, and sticky notes that tracked every name, date, and theory she could find, and with each new detail, the man from 1,000 years ago became less of a distant legend and more of a living presence in her mind, someone whose struggles and triumphs echoed in her own life, and she found herself thinking about him at the most ordinary moments, pouring coffee in the morning, waiting for the elevator, walking through the rainy streets of Portland, feeling a strange mix of admiration and curiosity, as if she could almost see the world through his eyes, understand the quiet power behind the intellect that had allowed him to survive where others had fallen, and yet there was a loneliness to him, a sense of being apart, that mirrored something deep inside herself, a feeling she had spent years trying to ignore. She spent hours reading translations and interpretations, some dry and factual, others romanticized or exaggerated, each adding a layer to her understanding, and she realized that the story wasn't about battles or bloodlines alone, but about how someone could navigate a world that constantly underestimated them, using wit, strategy, and patience, and this realization made her heart pound in a way she hadn't expected, because it reminded her of her own life, of how she had often felt overlooked or underestimated in her career, her relationships, even her friendships, and yet she had survived, grown, and learned to trust her mind and intuition, just as Ivar had, and in a quiet, almost secret way, she felt a kinship across the centuries that was both thrilling and comforting. Amid all this research, her phone buzzed with a video call from Daniel, her friend and collaborator in Toronto, someone who had quietly supported her podcast work for years without ever demanding attention, someone whose calm presence made her feel safe when the weight of history and research became overwhelming, and when she saw his face on the screen, framed by the warm light of his apartment, she felt a small jolt of relief, a spark she hadn't noticed until now, and she realized how much she depended on his voice, his observations, his subtle encouragement. "You sound different lately," he said softly, noticing her distracted energy, her eyes that often stared past the camera as if she were seeing something invisible, and she paused before answering, trying to explain what had taken over her thoughts for the past 10 days. "I think this story is changing me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what I expected, it's not about violence or glory, it's about being underestimated, being seen as weak, and still finding your way, still making your mark." Daniel listened in silence, the kind of silence that didn't rush her to fill it, and after a long moment he said, "That sounds familiar," and though his words were simple, they struck her like lightning, as if he understood something she hadn't dared admit to herself, the quiet resilience, the way both she and Ivar had learned to survive in a world that often overlooked the subtle but powerful, and she felt a strange warmth in her chest, a feeling that was both comforting and confusing, because it made her realize that the connection she felt to history was beginning to overlap with the connection she felt to Daniel. She laughed softly, shaking her head, realizing that she had spent days talking to people long dead, studying a life frozen in time, yet it was a living, breathing human in her screen who was quietly changing the way she thought about herself, about courage, about connection. And as the days passed, the rain outside became a familiar rhythm, her apartment a cocoon of thought and quiet longing, and every page she read, every translation she compared, every historian's note she argued within her mind brought her closer to a truth she hadn't expected. Understanding Ivar wasn't just about knowing history, it was about seeing the strength that comes from being underestimated, about realizing that resilience can be quiet, unrecognized, and yet unstoppable. And this idea haunted her, comforted her, and challenged her all at once. Late one night, as she scrolled through a particularly difficult manuscript, the words in Old Norse painstakingly rendered into English, she felt a shiver of recognition, a moment where past and present seemed to meet, and she thought of Daniel, of his steady presence, of how he had always been patient with her, never rushing, never pushing, just allowing her to unfold at her own pace, and she realized how much she wanted someone to see her fully, to understand her resilience, her struggles, her fears, the parts of herself she rarely shared, and how terrifying and thrilling that was to admit, even to herself. Emma's apartment grew darker as the night deepened, but she didn't turn on the lights. The glow of her laptop was enough, illuminating the notes and images scattered around her, and she felt a strange intimacy with the world she had created around Ivar's story, a small universe where she could explore, imagine, and feel without fear, and she began to wonder if this obsession with history, this intense focus on a man from centuries ago, was less about the past and more about discovering something inside herself, about confronting her own vulnerabilities and desires, and maybe even preparing her heart for something she hadn't expected, something that could arrive quietly, like Daniel's voice over the phone, or the gentle echo of a story that refused to be forgotten. Days melted into nights, and Emma found herself reading with increasing urgency, her notes becoming more personal, reflecting not just historical facts but questions she wanted answered about life, about courage, about how one survives with dignity in a world that doesn't understand them, and in every note, she could feel the pulse of someone alive in her mind, someone who had existed long before her, and yet whose experience resonated with her own, and she realized that studying Ivar was changing the way she thought about her own limitations, her own potential, and her own heart. By the end of the week, she had created a small ritual, coffee in hand, rain tapping at the window, headphones in, Daniel's occasional check-ins over video, and her eyes scanning the ancient texts, connecting dots, imagining conversations, and piecing together a man's life in ways no one could fully know, and yet every detail made her feel more alive, more aware, more capable of feeling and understanding human connection, both past and present. And in the quiet moments, when the storm outside softened and the city lights reflected in the wet streets below, she found herself smiling at the thought of Ivar not as a distant, cold legend but as a person who had survived against the odds, a man who had navigated his world with patience, wit, and courage, and in that reflection, she saw a mirror of her own life, her own quiet determination, and the beginnings of a truth she hadn't admitted until now, that understanding history could also mean understanding herself, and that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something unexpected, something human and tender, to enter her own life, carried not by the past alone but by the present, by the voice and presence of someone who had always been quietly there, waiting for her to notice him. As Emma delved deeper into Ivar's life, she began to feel something unexpected, a connection that went beyond admiration for his intelligence or survival skills. She saw in him a reflection of her own heart, the quiet struggles, the moments of being underestimated, the loneliness that sometimes settled in her chest even in crowded rooms, and she realized that studying him was teaching her something about herself, about the courage it took to be seen, to be vulnerable, and to demand respect without raising your voice, and that realization made her think of Daniel in a new light, of his patient attention during late-night calls, his gentle encouragement, the way he listened without judgment and made her feel like her thoughts, however chaotic or obsessive, mattered, and suddenly, she noticed small things she had overlooked before, the way his eyes softened when he spoke, the subtle warmth in his tone, the ease with which he shared his own struggles, and she began to anticipate their conversations with a flutter in her chest she didn't fully understand at first, a mixture of excitement and fear, because acknowledging these feelings meant risking something she had carefully protected for years, the certainty that she could rely on herself alone, and yet the thought of Daniel made her feel lighter, as if the world had stretched just a little wider around her. And in the quiet evenings when Portland's streets glimmered wet with rain, Emma imagined walking alongside him, sharing thoughts, dreams, and fears in the way Ivar must have shared his strategies with trusted allies. And she realized that she wanted someone to see all of her, the doubts, the obsessions, the intensity she carried, the vulnerability she rarely revealed, and the truth of her heart. And the irony was that she had spent days connecting to a man long dead, only to find herself noticing the heartbeat of someone alive, someone who had always been quietly present, patiently waiting. And that thought made her smile and ache at the same time, because desire and fear tangled in her chest like a storm refusing to settle. She caught herself imagining what it would be like to be fully known by Daniel, to have him understand the way her mind wandered into history and emotion, to have him see the strength that came from quiet persistence, the passion hidden behind calm words. And she realized that her fascination with Ivar had prepared her for this feeling, had shown her that being underestimated, misunderstood, or judged did not diminish one's worth, and in fact, it could make the heart more open, more capable of connection, more ready to accept something real, tender, and human. During a long video call one night, she found herself speaking more honestly than ever before, confessing thoughts she had locked away for years, the insecurities, the longing, the quiet fear of being rejected if anyone truly saw her. And as she spoke, Daniel listened, not interrupting, not minimizing, just absorbing her words with a calm intensity that made her chest ache in the best possible way. And when he finally replied, his voice soft, careful, yet full of emotion, he said, "Some people don't leave when they see your flaws. They stay because of them." And in that instant, Emma felt her heart open wider than it had in years, a rush of warmth, understanding, and yearning that she could neither name nor resist, because it was gentle, honest, and entirely new, yet somehow inevitable. Over the next few days, Emma found herself imagining small gestures, moments she had shared with Daniel, the quiet laughter, the comforting silences, the subtle encouragements, and she realized that she had been longing for this intimacy all along, the kind that didn't demand or overwhelm, but allowed hearts to meet in quiet recognition. And she began to write her podcast scripts differently, letting more emotion, more reflection, more human depth seep into her work, because Ivar's story had shown her the beauty of subtlety, the power of restraint, and the significance of what goes unnoticed yet shapes lives profoundly. And she saw parallels in her own feelings, in her desire to connect, to be fully seen, to trust someone with her heart. One evening, after hours of comparing manuscripts and interpreting historians' notes, Emma leaned back in her chair and let her thoughts wander to Daniel, imagining walking with him along Portland's riverfront, rain falling softly around them, the city lights reflecting in puddles, and feeling the quiet thrill of knowing that someone understood, someone saw her, even in moments she thought were invisible. And that made her pulse race, her chest tighten. And yet it was not fear alone, it was hope, anticipation, and something tenderly romantic that she could no longer ignore. She thought about how Ivar had survived, how he had commanded respect not with brute force but through understanding, influence, and careful strategy, and she realized that love, in its own quiet way, required similar patience, understanding, and courage, that the heart could be gentle yet powerful, subtle yet undeniable, and that Daniel's presence in her life mirrored the very lessons she had learned from history, the unspoken strength of patience, loyalty, and insight. And she felt an emotional resonance that was both thrilling and unsettling, because opening her heart, admitting desire, acknowledging tenderness was a risk she had avoided for so long. Emma began to notice her own emotions more acutely, the flutter of her heartbeat when Daniel laughed, the warmth that spread through her chest when he offered a thoughtful word, the ache when a call ended and the screen went dark, leaving only the memory of his voice lingering in her mind. And she realized that she was falling into something she had never expected, a gentle, deep, romantic tension that was not rushed, not dramatic, but steady and consuming in a way that felt entirely new, entirely alive. She reflected on the irony that studying a man who lived over 1,000 years ago had led her to confront her own heart, to recognize her desire for connection, intimacy, and understanding, and to see that vulnerability did not mean weakness, that longing did not mean desperation, that noticing someone so completely could be an act of courage, and that letting herself feel deeply could be transformative. One night, as rain fell heavily against her apartment window and the glow of her laptop lit her face, Emma found herself writing notes not only about Ivar but about Daniel, about the way he made her feel, the way he inspired quiet strength and tenderness in her own heart, and she paused, realizing she had never allowed herself to imagine such a possibility before, someone alive, real, patient, tender, who could walk with her through storms both literal and emotional, and she felt an overwhelming mix of hope, longing, and fear that mirrored everything she had read about Ivar's own challenges, his triumphs, his quiet brilliance, and she understood that this was the turning point, the moment when history and her own life intertwined in a way that was deeply personal, emotional, and profoundly romantic. The tension grew with every thought, every imagined glance, every unspoken word between them, a beautiful ache that made her pulse quicken, her chest tighten, her mind whirl with possibilities, and she realized she had spent weeks learning about courage, resilience, and connection from the past, only to discover that the most important lessons were unfolding in the present, through subtle glances, gentle words, and the quiet acknowledgement of hearts inching closer together, and in that moment, Emma knew that the emotional and romantic tension she felt was not only real but transformative, a delicate, tender, entirely human force that had been quietly shaping her life, her understanding of love, and her readiness to take the next step towards something she had longed for in ways she hadn't fully admitted until now. And as she closed her laptop that night, listening to the rain, she felt a thrill of anticipation for the days to come, for the possibilities, for the soft, steady, undeniable pull between her and Daniel, and she knew that the story of Ivar the Boneless had taught her more than history ever could. It had shown her the courage to feel, to long, and to open her heart to someone who had always been there. On the 10th day of her research, Emma felt a surge of excitement and dread as she uncovered a detail about Ivar the Boneless that none of the mainstream sources had emphasized. His greatest strength, according to some historians, was not the fear he inspired or the battles he commanded, but the quiet influence he held over those who trusted him, the subtle ways he guided, inspired, and connected with people, building alliances not through force but through understanding, insight, and patience. And as Emma read the translated manuscripts and studied the interpretations, she realized that everything she had learned about courage, resilience, and human connection was embodied in this truth, that being remembered, being valued, and making an impact did not require a loud display of power but a willingness to see and understand others, and the revelation struck her in a way she had not expected, because it mirrored her own life and feelings, especially the growing connection with Daniel, who had always shown her the quiet power of presence, of listening, of seeing her fully, without judgment or expectation, and suddenly, the story she had spent 10 days immersed in became more than history, it became a lens to examine her own heart, her desires, her fears, and her longing for something real and tender. Just as she was absorbing the last of the manuscripts, her phone buzzed with an unexpected message from Daniel, telling her that he had been offered a position in Seattle, only a few hours away from Portland, and that he had accepted it, adding, with an honest hesitation, that he hadn't planned it because of her, yet he realized he did not want distance to decide the course of his life or his relationships, and Emma's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing with possibilities, fears, and hope, because for days she had been quietly feeling the pull between them, the subtle, growing romantic tension that had both excited and frightened her, and now the universe, or fate, or whatever force she chose to believe in, had put them within reach. And she had to confront the truth of her own heart. She thought of Ivar again, the way he had survived in a harsh world by understanding the importance of alliances, of influence, of emotional intelligence, and she realized that she and Daniel were facing a similar challenge, not of survival, but of allowing themselves to fully acknowledge their feelings, to take the risk of opening their hearts, to act with courage in a world that often demanded restraint, and that thought made her pulse quicken with anticipation and fear. Over the next hours, Emma could barely focus on the research or even on her apartment. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening, the air crisp, and she found herself pacing, imagining the conversations, the moments, the small gestures that could finally bridge the space between them, and yet every imagined step was accompanied by the quiet terror of rejection, the haunting possibility that one misstep could undo what had been building slowly, beautifully, over days of connection, understanding, and shared moments of vulnerability. She replayed every call, every message, every subtle glance and word exchanged with Daniel, seeing patterns she hadn't noticed before, moments of care, hints of longing, and the gentle, quiet ways he had made room for her heart to expand, and she realized that he had been patient all along, as if he understood what she was only now beginning to comprehend, that love, connection, and trust required time, observation, and courage, just like Ivar had required from his followers, and in that moment, Emma felt both exhilarated and terrified, the mix of fear and hope making her chest ache and her mind whirl with questions about the future, about the possibility of love, about the power of timing, and about whether she could allow herself to fully step into what was unfolding. The hours blurred into evening as she considered the choices before her, the delicate balance between caution and action, and she realized that she could no longer avoid the truth. She wanted Daniel in her life in a way that was tender, deep, and romantic, and the way she had felt for days, subtle, patient, but undeniable, was not just a passing thought but a revelation about what her heart truly longed for, and she understood that it would take courage to act, courage to speak, courage to let her feelings be known, just as Ivar had shown courage in the quiet, strategic ways he influenced the world around him. By the time the rain began again, soft and rhythmic, Emma had decided she could not let fear hold her back, that the moment required honesty, that she had to risk vulnerability to experience something real, and she felt a strange alignment between the lessons of history and the life she was living now, the past and present folding into each other, urging her to take a step forward. That evening, Daniel called, his voice warm, careful, slightly hesitant, and when he spoke about his move to Seattle, about the changes it would bring, about the excitement and the unknown, Emma listened with a racing heart, her thoughts filled with visions of walks together along rainy streets, quiet conversations over coffee, moments of laughter and shared understanding, and she realized that the distance she had feared might have existed was now collapsing, that the universe was giving them a chance, and that the choice to embrace it rested entirely with her. They talked for hours, about work, about history, about personal dreams, and in between the words, in the pauses, the silences, and the subtle emotions, Emma felt the tension that had been building over days finally shift, a quiet current of hope, tenderness, and attraction that made every heartbeat more noticeable, every breath more charged, every word more meaningful, and she understood that the twist she had been waiting for in her research, the revelation about Ivar's influence through connection, was mirrored perfectly in her own life, that just as he had built respect and power through patience, intelligence, and understanding, she and Daniel had the chance to build something equally strong, equally beautiful, rooted not in grand gestures but in quiet, honest human connection. Late into the night, as Portland slept and the streets glimmered with reflections from the rain, Emma sat by her window, thinking about the days she had spent immersed in history, thinking about the courage she had discovered in Ivar, thinking about the quiet romantic tension, the longing, the vulnerability, and the possibility of love that now hovered in her own life. And she realized that the major twist was not just historical, not just a fact about a man long dead, but personal, alive, and transformative, because the lessons she had learned were no longer confined to her research, they had become a roadmap for her heart, guiding her to face the unknown, embrace vulnerability, and take a step towards someone she had quietly loved and trusted more than she had admitted. And in that moment, as the rain fell softly and the city glowed under streetlights, Emma understood that history had given her more than knowledge, it had given her courage, insight, and the unexpected clarity to see what she truly wanted, and she knew that she could no longer wait or hide, she had to let the present meet her heart, let desire and connection unfold, and let the story she had spent 10 days uncovering shape not just the past, but her own life, her own love, and her own future. With Daniel, and that realization made her pulse quicken, her breath catch, and a quiet, thrilling hope settle in her chest that the next chapter, the next step, would finally bring what she had been waiting for all along.